Trump so far has shown no sign of backing down against their wailing and lamentations. Today, the president tweeted this: "Everybody is arguing about whether or not it's a ban. Call it what you want. It's about keeping bad people with bad intentions out of the country." Well, Michelle Brane is the director of migrant rights and the justice program at the Women's Refugee Commission. She's called on people to resist President Trump's executive orders and says that sanctuary cities make this country safer. Michelle Brane joins us now. Michelle, thanks a lot for coming on.
You're very welcome.
Let me just say at the outset that I think that your motivations seem totally pure. I've read a lot about you. I think you're trying to do good work for people in need, and so I respect that. But I'm looking also at the polling on refugee resettlement, and the public cannot be described as supporting it now or in the past. Strikingly low support for resettling refugees in this country. And if you ask people, do you want them resettled where you live, in your neighborhood, it's even lower. And I'm wondering why that is. Why do you think people don't support it?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that people don't support it, right? I think some polls show that they don't, and I know that support for the programs varies, right? It varies over time, and it varies geographically and among different groups of people.
But I think it's fair to say there's not overwhelming support for it. I mean, correct. I could point to some numbers here that are pretty low.
Yes, in some cases they are low, but I think overall, at least the Americans that I engage with, and maybe I try to be diverse in my encounters with people, but I think people do support it. I do think that people are concerned sometimes, right, about how it's going to affect the country. But I think if you look at pockets where there is resettlement,
yes,
there is support. And in fact, many communities that have resettled refugees ask for more refugees. Huh. That's actually more common than communities who've experienced having refugees in their community saying we don't want them, right?
I guess what I find interesting, though, in this debate, there's almost no conversation that I have heard about the effect of refugee resettlement on Americans. There's the obvious point that's often made that if you're fleeing some war-riven country or a poor country, of course, it's a massive upgrade to come to America. Right. But what about the Americans? So you tweeted out recently, you said asylum seekers at our border are fleeing violence, which is obviously true. Central America, among the most dangerous regions in the world. Right. That's all completely true. Right. So a lot of Central Americans have been resettled here, Salvadorans, Hondurans, et cetera. We've also seen a cost to that, though. MS-13 didn't exist before large numbers of Central Americans came here. Not attacking all of them, but that's a real thing that's affected Americans. Do you recognize that as a cost?
First of all, I would note that MS-13 didn't exist before the U.S. started imprisoning and returning Central Americans to Central America, right? So we could, and I don't want to get into the root causes of it, but the gangs started in the United States, in Los Angeles, and were actually deported to Central America. So, I don't know that...
I'm not sure I'm following your logic.
Well, the point is just that they didn't necessarily
start in
Central America. I'm not an expert on that issue. I just wanted to point out that they didn't start there. But to your point, let me just get to your point.
But there's still refugees who are here, and their presence has created a massive crime problem called MS-13. That's a cost, isn't it?
Well, again, first of all, I think we need to distinguish between refugees and people who come here in other ways, right? I just want to make sure that the audience understands that we have a formal refugee resettlement program.
Not all immigrants are refugees,
which is what has been... which is what one of the executive orders addresses directly is refugees, right? Right. Central Americans coming, for the most part, are not refugees. There is a small refugee program now that just started and is likely to not continue. It's on halt now, right? But they come in as asylum seekers, which is different. But it's a technical thing. We don't need to worry about it. But yes.
But there's no doubt that refugees from Central America have wound up in criminal gangs.
Of course. There's criminals in all communities, right? I would argue, though, to your point of what immigrants and refugees have done for this country and the effect on it, I think overwhelmingly it's a positive effect, not a negative effect.
Okay, but don't you think that you weaken your case by downplaying or refusing to acknowledge the downside of it?
There's always downsides. I'm going to acknowledge
but when that I guess here's how I'm...
You want a vet who's coming in, right? And you want to treat them like anybody else. If they commit crimes, they should be...
But will you acknowledge something that I think common sense confirms, and I also think social science proves it, that when people are coming from war-torn places and grown up around conflict and violence, obviously you want to rescue them from that, but it also increases the likelihood that they'll be involved in conflict and violence.
I don't think there's any evidence
of that. Well, I think there's quite a bit of that.
Well, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen that evidence.
People who grow up in places, and I'm not attacking them at all, I'm just saying it makes a kind of sense, and I think MS-13, and there are many other examples of this, certainly throughout the world where refugees have been resettled, that's a potential cost. Would you acknowledge that?
What I would say is that what we know and is fact is that communities with higher immigrant populations, including the populations you're talking about, actually have lower crime rates than communities that
So you're saying if we were to import...
So there's a lower crime rate among the immigrant population in the United States than there is among the non-immigrant.
The native-born population. Yeah. But doesn't it also make sense, and hard to kind of deny this, that if you import people from peaceful... The people bring part of their culture with them.
Sure.
And if you bring people from very violent countries, they're more likely to commit violence when they get here.
Not if they're fleeing that violence, right? If somebody is actually
But do you have evidence to show that? I don't think that that's true, actually.
Well,
so
have you ever met any of the people we're talking about? Because
sure, and I'm not attacking them. I'm just saying we're talking about large numbers of people, so we're speaking in the aggregate, and I have a lot of sympathy for people who want to get out of El Salvador, for sure, or Syria for that matter. But I also think it's worth worrying about Americans to whom we owe an allegiance as fellow Americans, and to whom our government owes its only allegiance.
Sure.
And so, like, to say there's no cost, they're all great, that's a lie, and everyone knows that.
I'm not saying that. I've never said that all immigrants are great, right? I mean, I think immigrants should be treated like any other citizen in our community.
Why would they be treated
like individual?
But they're not citizens.
If they commit a crime, well, all right, individual. I mean citizen as a person, so that was a mistake on my part, but they should be treated like anybody else in our country. If they commit crimes, they should be charged with those crimes, right?
Why would you want to import anybody? I mean, we're doing this voluntarily, okay? We're doing a good deed.
The population we're importing, as
why would you want
are not
any
criminals.
Okay, but some of them actually are, and you know that to be true. I'm not saying most are. I think most are good people, and they want to be here for the right reasons, and I get it. But if you're importing people at your expense, and the U.S. government pays for this, as you know.
We're not paying for asylum seekers to come to the United States.
We're paying for the cost of bearing them once they arrive, as you know.
They don't
and that
really
cost
no, I'm not. They're not eligible for any benefit.
Well, they go to public schools, and let me ask you about that. So we have resettled immigrants all over the country, but disproportionately to poor communities for a bunch of different reasons I know you're familiar with. Buffalo is one of them.
Right.
There's a piece today in the New York Post by Betsy McCoy. It's really interesting. Last decade, 10,000 refugees go to Buffalo. A lot of them wind up at Lafayette High School. 45 languages spoken there. 70% of the students are just learning English.
Right.
Now, this is one of the worst schools in the state of New York. 14% of people graduate on time. This is a massive burden for the school. It doesn't help the people who are already there. Right. The obvious question is, why aren't we resettling them in places where people support refugee resettlement, like Chevy Chase, Maryland, or Beverly Hills, California? Because people don't want to bear the cost of the policies they support.
Refugees are resettled in communities that do voluntarily accept them. The government does not force refugees in communities. So, in general, as I said earlier, communities that receive refugees generally are asking for them, are benefiting from them, and are very happy to have them there.
So if you had a child,
Utica, for example, right?
Come on, if you had a child at a school that all of a sudden became half immigrant, non-English speaking. I don't care if every one of those kids is smart and disciplined and hardworking. That's a massive cost.
You know what? I'm really glad you said that, Tucker, because my kids do go to a school like that.
What percentage non-English speaking is it?
I don't know, but there are a lot. They have several kids in their class.
Well, then you know it's a high cost to the school. It is. And why not acknowledge that?
And the community, well, it is a cost to the school, but the community that I'm in and that my children go to school in is welcoming of those kids. They're happy to have it. Parents volunteer and work with them. The kids learn a lot from having this diverse cultures in their classes. And overall, I would say that it's a positive thing. I'm not denying it's a cost.
Both of us live in one of the most affluent areas in the country. Here's my point, and this is, I guess, what bothers me. There's an unfairness for affluent people like us to turn to the rest of the country and say, you're bigots for not supporting the resettlement of people who don't speak our language, don't share our culture, and whose costs we will pay for. You're a bad person if you're not for that.
I don't think I've ever called anybody a bigot.
But isn't the position on Trump's executive orders that anyone who's for this is motivated by bigotry or dislike of the other? And that's not a fair thing to say.
Well, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that receiving refugees and welcoming refugees in what I believe is an American tradition is something that I'm very proud of as an American.
Right.
It's something that I don't like to see turned its back on. And that's my point, really.
Let me ask you one last question then, and it's about assimilation. Mm-hmm. So some of these are people who already share our values and are familiar with our country, but many of them are not, and they're coming from places whose values are not just different from ours, but opposed to ours. They don't believe in an open liberal society, and I've got a lot of data to back it up. Okay. What are we doing when we import someone from a country where 98% of the women have experienced genital mutilation, for example, and people don't believe that men and women are equal, they hate gays? What are we doing to bring them in to our culture and to convince them that our values are the right values? I don't see that we're doing much.
Actually, I think we are. I think that's one of the great things about America. I think that you will see that it takes one generation or less for people to really become assimilated. And in fact, studies are showing that recent immigrants are actually assimilating much quicker than they did in the past.
So what percentage?
They learn English, they have American friends, they adopt American, social norms and cultural experiences.
So what percentage of immigrant families from, say, Somalia, where there's a 98% occurrence of female genital mutilation, practice that on their daughters in the United States?
I have no idea.
Do you think it would be interesting to know?
Sure, and maybe there's a study out there that says it, but I don't know what it is, right? But my experience has been that when I speak to Somali young women who have immigrated to this country or whose parents have immigrated to this country, they are very American to me.
But do you tell them that that's wrong?
Well, I haven't had that conversation with very many of them, but many
why not?
I have had that conversation with some of them. Look, we worked on. I was at the Board of Immigration Appeals at the Department of Justice at the time when the famous FGM case came up.
I remember.
And a lot of people were arguing that FGM is not a practice that is acceptable, especially by force, right?
Well, it's illegal, among other things, but it still continues, and I just wish we would take a stand.
I don't know what the rates are in the U.S. I don't have any problem with that.
All right. Thanks a lot for joining us, Michelle.
You're very welcome. Thank you.